June 19th, 1944. 30 hours. Flag bridge of IJN Taiho, 150 miles west of Saipan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa pressed the Zeiss binoculars against his eyes, watching the morning sun illuminate the largest carrier formation Japan had ever assembled. 9 carriers spread across the Philippine Sea, their flight decks alive with activity as mechanics made final preparations for the massive strike that would, Ozawa believed, finally destroy American naval power in the Pacific. The tall admiral, over 6 feet, unusual for a Japanese officer, had spent the night reviewing intelligence reports. The American invasion of Saipan had begun 4 days earlier, and now the moment he had prepared for had arrived. The decisive battle, the engagement that would vindicate 2 years of defensive operations and turn the tide of the war. His flagship Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. Around him, the combined fleet's carrier strength stood ready. The veterans Shokaku and Zuikaku, the light carriers Chiyoda, Chitose, and Zuiho, and the smaller Ryuho, Hyo, and Junyo. Nearly 500 aircraft would launch in coordinated waves, their superior range allowing them to strike the American fleet while remaining beyond the reach of enemy counterattack. What Ozawa didn't know, what none of the Japanese commanders could have imagined, was that they were about to encounter not merely an American fleet, but the physical manifestation of industrial capacity so overwhelming that Japanese naval strategy had become obsolete before the first aircraft left his deck. The mathematics of defeat had already been written in the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia, where American welders and riveters were rewriting the rules of naval warfare at a pace Japan's most optimistic planners had dismissed as propaganda. The previous 2 years had taught Ozawa caution. He had witnessed the steady erosion of Japan's carrier strength, the irreplaceable loss of experienced pilots, the growing superiority of American equipment and training. But Japanese naval doctrine still held that quality could overcome quantity, that superior tactics and the warrior spirit of Japanese aviators would prevail against American industrial might. Standing on Taiho's bridge that morning, commanding the largest carrier force Japan had ever concentrated in a single operation, Ozawa allowed himself to believe the decisive battle might still be won. His staff had calculated carefully. American carrier strength in the Pacific was estimated at perhaps 8 to 10 carriers. The loss of Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway had been confirmed. Wasp and Hornet had been sunk in 1942. The Americans possessed Enterprise, Saratoga, and perhaps 6 or 7 new carriers. The numbers seemed manageable, especially with land-based aircraft from Guam, Tinian, and Rota supplementing the carrier strike. Japanese aircraft, with their longer range, could hit the Americans from 300 miles while remaining beyond the 200-mile reach of American planes. The plan was sound, the execution would be flawless, and the outcome, Ozawa hoped, would be victory. At 8:30, the first wave began launching. Ozawa watched with satisfaction as 69 aircraft roared off Taiho's deck, followed by waves from the other carriers. By 1,000 hours, over 300 aircraft had launched in 4 massive strikes. The largest carrier offensive since Midway was airborne, and Ozawa's staff began the tense wait for contact reports and battle results. The flag bridge buzzed with controlled energy, radio men monitoring frequencies, intelligence officers plotting expected American positions, and Ozawa himself maintaining the calm demeanor expected of a Japanese admiral. The first indication that something was wrong came not from returning pilots, but from the absence of their return. Radio reports became confused, contradictory. Pilots reported being intercepted by American fighters 70 miles from the enemy fleet. Impossible if American carriers were where Japanese intelligence had placed them. The interceptions were being made by dozens of Hellcats, far more than a single carrier air group could provide. Strike leaders reported overwhelming fighter opposition, aircraft being shot down in groups, formations disintegrating under coordinated attacks that seemed to come from every altitude and direction simultaneously. By noon, the magnitude of the disaster was becoming clear. Of the 69 aircraft in the first wave, fewer than 30 returned. The second wave suffered even worse losses. The third wave, launched at midday, was massacred. American fighters seemed to be everywhere, their pilots exhibiting skill and coordination that Japanese intelligence had assured Ozawa the Americans lacked. More disturbing still were the reports from surviving pilots. The American fleet wasn't 8 or 10 carriers. They had counted 15, perhaps more, spread across the horizon in task groups that stretched for miles. Ozawa's staff initially dismissed these reports as combat stress and poor visibility. 15 American carriers was impossible. The United States had entered the war with 7 carriers. Japan had sunk or severely damaged at least 4. American shipbuilding, while impressive, couldn't possibly have replaced those losses and added 8 or 9 more carriers in just 2 years. The calculations didn't make sense. Yet the reports kept coming, each one confirming the impossible. The Americans had assembled a carrier force that outnumbered Japan's maximum effort by nearly 2 to 1. At 12:20, disaster struck closer to home. The submarine USS Albacore's torpedoes found Taiho, and though the damage initially seemed manageable, poor damage control would doom the ship. But Ozawa's attention was focused on the aerial catastrophe unfolding across the Philippine Sea. By 1400 hours, the terrible truth could no longer be denied. Of nearly 400 aircraft launched that morning, fewer than 100 would return. American fighters had shot them down in droves in what American pilots were already calling the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The decisive battle had become a massacre, but not the massacre Japanese planners had envisioned. As Ozawa transferred his flag to the cruiser Haguro after Taiho's loss, the numbers began to crystallize with brutal clarity. Japanese intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about American carrier strength. The enemy fleet wasn't 8 or 10 carriers. It was 15 large carriers, plus numerous light carriers and escort carriers. Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's command, had brought to battle a force that represented not just numerical superiority, but an entirely different order of naval power. That evening, as Ozawa's shattered air groups attempted to land in darkness and confusion, the admiral faced a realization that would haunt Japanese naval planning for the remainder of the war. The Americans hadn't simply repaired and rebuilt their carrier fleet. They had created something unprecedented. A mass-produced armada of standardized fleet carriers, each one as capable as Japan's finest, built in quantities that defied every assumption about industrial capacity and maritime construction. The intelligence reports Ozawa reviewed that night, salvaged from Taiho before her final plunge, contained fragmentary information about American carrier construction that his staff had previously dismissed as exaggeration. Ships completed in 18 months, multiple carriers launched simultaneously from different yards, a class called Essex that was being produced not in ones or twos, but by the dozens. Ozawa, an innovative thinker who had long advocated for carriers as the Navy's primary striking arm, understood immediately what this meant. Japan wasn't fighting the United States Navy of 1941. They were fighting an industrial colossus that could absorb losses and produce replacements faster than Japan could inflict damage. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would continue for another day, with American carrier aircraft hunting down and destroying additional Japanese carriers, but the strategic verdict was already written. In 18 hours of combat, Japan had lost nearly 400 carrier aircraft and 3 carriers, including the brand-new Taiho, while the Americans suffered minimal losses. More critically, Japan had lost the majority of its remaining experienced pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had fought since Pearl Harbor. These men couldn't be replaced. Not in time, not with Japan's limited training infrastructure. But it was the numbers that truly devastated Ozawa's strategic calculations. 15 American carriers in a single task force meant the United States possessed a carrier fleet larger than Japan had ever fielded in its entire history. And if intelligence reports were accurate, more were being commissioned every month. The Americans had somehow accomplished what Japanese planners had deemed impossible. They had industrialized carrier warfare, turning what Japan treated as precious capital ships into mass-produced weapons of strategic power. Standing on Haguro's bridge that night, watching the horizon where his carriers had been, Ozawa understood what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned about before Pearl Harbor. The Americans, once fully mobilized, possessed industrial capacity beyond Japanese comprehension. They didn't win through superior tactics or warrior spirit. They won through overwhelming material superiority, through the ability to replace every loss twice over, through shipyards that worked around the clock, producing carriers as if they were destroyers. The decisive battle had indeed occurred on June 19, 1944. But it hadn't been decided by tactics, training, or courage. It had been decided in the foundries of Pennsylvania, the assembly lines of New York, and the shipyards of Virginia, where American workers were building carriers faster than Japanese submarines could sink them, faster than kamikazes could damage them, faster than Japan could even count them. Ozawa had commanded 9 carriers that morning, the largest force Japan had ever concentrated. By nightfall, 6 remained operational, their air groups decimated. Across the horizon, 15 American carriers steamed in perfect formation, their decks already being restocked with aircraft from the seemingly limitless production lines that fed the American war machine. The battle had revealed something more terrifying than tactical defeat. Japan was fighting an enemy who could afford to lose and still have reserves, while Japan couldn't afford to lose anything. The story of how America built 24 Essex-class carriers, while Japan struggled to replace even one, had begun 2 years earlier, in the desperate months after Pearl Harbor. But its origins stretched back further, to fundamental differences in industrial philosophy, economic capacity, and strategic vision that meant Japan had never really had a chance. Ozawa didn't yet know the full scope of what he faced, but standing on that cruiser bridge, watching the last aircraft of his broken air groups struggle to land, he knew enough. The war was over. Everything that followed would be just mathematics and dying. The genesis of Japan's defeat had begun long before Ozawa's carriers burned in the Philippine Sea. It started in the spring of 1940, when American naval architects gathered in the Bureau of Ships to design what would become the most numerous class of capital ships in history. The irony was profound. While Japanese admirals were celebrating their alliance with Germany and planning their southern expansion, American engineers were already designing the weapons that would destroy them. Commander Leslie Kniskern, the chief design officer at the Bureau of Ships, faced a problem that would have seemed luxurious to his Japanese counterparts. The Washington Naval Treaty, which had constrained carrier construction since 1922, had finally expired. For the first time in 2 decades, American designers could build carriers limited only by practical constraints rather than diplomatic agreements. The challenge wasn't what they were allowed to build. It was what they needed to build, and how many. The design conferences that produced the Essex class read like a masterclass in the fundamental differences between American and Japanese naval philosophy. Where Japanese designers obsessed over individual ship superiority and tactical elegance, the Americans thought in terms of production efficiency and operational sustainability. Captain James Russell, the carrier desk officer at the Bureau of Aeronautics, had just completed 2 years aboard USS Yorktown and understood carrier operations with an intimacy few officers possessed. His input would prove decisive. "Gentlemen," Russell told the design team during one critical meeting in June 1940, "we need to assume we're building not one carrier, but dozens. Every decision must account for mass production, standardization, and rapid construction." The statement seemed absurd at the time. The U.S. Navy possessed 8 carriers. The idea of building dozens appeared to be planning for a war no one wanted to fight. But Russell, like a handful of prescient officers, understood that if war came with Japan, it would be decided by industrial output, not by the elegance of individual ship designs. The Essex design emerged from careful analysis of earlier carriers' strengths and weaknesses. The Yorktown class had proven generally successful, but treaty limitations had compromised their design. Now, unencumbered by treaty restrictions, the designers could optimize for actual combat requirements. They settled on a displacement of 27,100 tons standard, 36,380 tons fully loaded, nearly 40% larger than the Yorktowns. But more important than size was the philosophy embedded in every design decision. The flight deck measured 872 feet long and 108 feet wide, providing generous deck space for aircraft operations. Unlike Japanese carriers, which favored enclosed hangars and armored flight decks, the Essex design placed the strength deck at hangar level and left the flight deck unarmored. This seemingly counterintuitive choice actually improved survivability by allowing bomb blasts to vent upward rather than channeling explosive force through the ship's interior. The decision would save countless lives when kamikazes struck later in the war. One innovation particularly impressed visiting British naval architects, though they initially criticized it. The Essex design included a deck edge elevator on the port side, in addition to 2 centerline elevators. British carriers relied on armored elevators that, when damaged, became structural weaknesses in the flight deck. The American deck edge elevator could be destroyed without compromising the integrity of the flight deck itself. In practice, this meant Essex-class carriers could continue operations even with severe damage, a capability Japan's carriers fatally lacked. The machinery arrangement represented another fundamental difference in design philosophy. Japanese carriers like Taiho featured complex, tightly integrated engineering plants that maximized power output but created single points of failure. The Essex design distributed machinery across multiple compartments with extensive subdivision and redundancy. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 4 Westinghouse turbines generated 150,000 shaft horsepower, driving the ships at 33 knots. But more importantly, the engineering plant could sustain significant damage and continue operating, a feature that would prove its value repeatedly in the desperate battles of 1944 and 1945. Anti-aircraft armament reflected American expectations of future air warfare. The original design called for 12 5-inch or 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 4 twin and 4 single mounts, supplemented by 32 40mm Bofors and 46 20mm Oerlikon guns. These numbers would increase throughout the war as kamikaze attacks revealed the inadequacy of even this heavy defensive armament. Japanese carriers, by contrast, remained comparatively undergunned, their designers assuming fighter aircraft would provide primary air defense. The air group capacity demonstrated the American approach to carrier aviation. An Essex-class carrier was designed to operate 91 aircraft, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers, plus a single photographic reconnaissance aircraft. In practice, air groups were often larger, sometimes exceeding 100 aircraft. Japanese carriers of comparable size operated significantly fewer planes, typically 60 to 75, because their emphasis on range and individual aircraft capability meant larger, heavier planes that required more deck space. What truly distinguished the Essex design from Japanese carriers was its conception as a production item rather than a prestige weapon. Every aspect of the design considered manufacturing efficiency. The hull used extensive flat plate construction rather than complex curves, reducing construction time and allowing less skilled workers to participate in fabrication. Special treatment steel, a nickel-chrome alloy that served as both armor and structure, was used throughout, reducing weight while maintaining strength. The modular design meant sub-assemblies could be fabricated separately and rapidly integrated during construction. Commander Kniskern's team had designed a carrier that could be built quickly, operated efficiently, and sustained in combat. But they hadn't yet solved the production challenge: how to build not one or two carriers, but enough to overwhelm Japan's more experienced Navy. The answer would come from American industrial capacity that Japanese naval planners simply couldn't comprehend. On July 1, 1940, Congress authorized construction of the first 4 Essex-class carriers under the Two-Ocean Navy Act. The legislation represented a fundamental shift in American naval strategy, acknowledging that the United States needed to maintain fleets capable of simultaneous operations in both the Atlantic and Pacific. For Japan, which had struggled to maintain even one modern fleet, the implications should have been clear. America was preparing to fight multiple enemies across multiple oceans simultaneously. The contracts went to America's major shipyards: Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, and Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Pennsylvania. These facilities began gearing up for production even before the final designs were complete. Japanese naval intelligence monitored these developments with concern, but consistently underestimated the scale and speed of American construction. Japanese planners assumed American carriers would take 3 to 4 years to build, based on peacetime construction schedules. They couldn't imagine what American industry could accomplish when fully mobilized for war. The keel of USS Essex, CV-9, was laid at Newport News on April 28, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The ship took shape with a speed that would have astonished Japanese observers. Where Japanese carriers like Shokaku had required 3.5 years from keel laying to commissioning, Essex would be ready in just 20 months. And she would be merely the first of a production run that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed American carrier construction from a measured buildup into a desperate sprint. In the weeks following the attack, Navy planners realized with cold clarity that the battleship-centric fleet they'd spent decades building had become obsolete overnight. Carriers were now the decisive weapon of the Pacific War, and America possessed exactly 3 in the Pacific Fleet: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, to face Japan's 10. Production orders accelerated. The original authorization for 4 carriers expanded to 10, then 15, then 24. American shipyards, already tooled for mass production, shifted into high gear. Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Four River shipyards all received contracts for Essex-class construction. At peak production, 7 carriers would be under construction simultaneously at 5 different yards, an impossibility by Japanese standards, where a single yard might struggle to build 1 carrier at a time. The construction schedules defied Japanese assumptions about American capability. USS Essex, commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 20 months after her keel was laid. USS Yorktown, CV-10, named for the carrier lost at Midway, commissioned on April 15, 1943, just 16 and a half months from keel laying. The speed shocked even American observers. Japanese naval intelligence, receiving reports of these construction times through neutral sources, initially dismissed them as propaganda. No nation could build a 27,000-ton fleet carrier in less than 2 years. The calculations didn't make sense by any conventional understanding of shipbuilding, but America wasn't using conventional shipbuilding methods. The Essex program applied mass production techniques pioneered in automobile manufacturing to naval construction. Prefabricated sub-assemblies were built off-site and transported to the yards for rapid integration. Welding largely replaced riveting, reducing construction time and labor requirements. Multiple shifts worked around the clock, with shipyards illuminated like cities throughout the night, a sight that would have been impossible in blackout-shrouded Japan. The workforce itself represented a revolution. With millions of men serving in the armed forces, American shipyards increasingly relied on women workers who proved every bit as capable as their male predecessors. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was a statistical reality. By 1943, women comprised over 30% of shipyard workers, and their contribution was essential to maintaining the production schedules that would ultimately overwhelm Japan. The standardization that Kniskern had insisted upon proved its value repeatedly. Parts and equipment were interchangeable across all Essex-class carriers. A damaged ship could be rapidly repaired using components cannibalized from carriers still under construction. Crew training was standardized. A pilot qualified on Essex could operate from any carrier in the class. Maintenance procedures, damage control protocols, even the location of coffee pots and ammunition lockers. Everything was standardized to maximize operational efficiency. Japanese observers, watching from afar through intelligence reports and neutral sources, struggled to accept what the numbers told them. By mid-1943, America was commissioning a new Essex-class carrier every 60 days. The production rate was accelerating, not slowing. Yorktown in April, Lexington in May, Bunker Hill in June, Wasp in July, Hornet in August, Franklin and Ticonderoga in September. The names themselves told a story. America was naming new carriers after the ships Japan had sunk, a psychological message that the losses meant nothing when replacement ships were already under construction. The implications for Japanese naval strategy were catastrophic, though few in Tokyo fully grasped them yet. Japan had begun the war with a carrier force built over 2 decades. Replacing even a single fleet carrier required years of construction and massive resources that Japan's war economy increasingly couldn't provide. America was building carriers faster than Japan could sink them, and the gap was widening with every passing month. The decisive battle that Japanese doctrine demanded would never come, because America could afford to lose battles and still win the war through sheer industrial superiority. By December 1943, 2 years after Pearl Harbor, 11 Essex-class carriers were in commission, with 6 more under construction. The U.S. Navy had transformed from carrier-poor to carrier-rich in just 24 months. And they were just getting started. The production lines were hitting their stride, the workforce was experienced, and the industrial capacity was still expanding. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to complete even one new fleet carrier, the Taiho that would become Ozawa's doomed flagship. The stage was set for the confrontations that would reveal the full scope of Japan's miscalculation. The battles weren't about tactics or courage. They were about mathematics and production capacity, about an industrial democracy that could mobilize resources on a scale that a militaristic empire couldn't match. The war would be decided not by samurai spirit, but by shipyard workers in Virginia and Pennsylvania, building carriers in assembly line fashion, while Japan's best yards struggled to produce even one. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe tightened his flight harness as his Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber rolled into position on Zuikaku's flight deck. The morning sun of June 19th painted the carrier's deck a brilliant orange, and Abe allowed himself a moment of confidence. This was it. The decisive engagement that would vindicate 2 years of defensive operations. At 32 years old, Abe was a veteran of every major carrier battle since Pearl Harbor. He had bombed Lexington at Coral Sea, dodged American fighters at Midway, and survived the brutal attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. He was one of the increasingly rare experienced pilots left in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he commanded the second section of dive bombers in the second wave, 48 aircraft tasked with destroying American carriers. Abe-san, his radioman gunner, Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Yamada, called through the intercom from his rear-facing position. "I count all 9 carriers launching. This will be like Pearl Harbor in reverse." Abe didn't respond, his attention focused on the flight deck officer's signals. The officer's paddles swept down, and Abe pushed the throttle forward. The Judy accelerated down Zuikaku's deck, the Aichi Atsuta engine howling at full power. The carrier fell away beneath him, and Abe banked right to join the formation, assembling overhead. Within 20 minutes, 48 dive bombers had joined with 27 torpedo bombers and their fighter escorts. 109 aircraft, the largest strike wave Japan had launched since 1942, formed into a massive formation and turned east toward the American fleet. The flight was supposed to take 90 minutes. They would approach at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft fire, but low enough to ensure fuel reserves for the attack and return flight. The Americans were reported 150 miles away, well within the Judy's combat radius. Abe flew in tight formation with his section. The other dive bombers spread in neat V's across the sky. Below, the Philippine Sea stretched endlessly, its deep blue surface broken only by scattered whitecaps. 60 miles from the reported American position, Abe's radio crackled with the first warning from the fighter escort. "Enemy fighters approaching, high and to the east. Many fighters, very many." Abe's stomach tightened. Fighter interceptions this far from the American fleet were unusual, but not unprecedented. He scanned the sky ahead, seeing nothing but scattered clouds. Then Yamada's voice cut through the intercom, sharp with alarm. "Aircraft above us! 10 o'clock high! 20 contacts!" Abe looked up and felt his confidence drain like water through a sieve. The Americans were diving from 20,000 feet. Dark blue Grumman F6F Hellcats falling like hawks on rabbits. But it wasn't 20 fighters. It was dozens, perhaps 50, their wings packed with 650 caliber machine guns each. The fighter escort, 12 obsolete Zero fighters turned to engage, but they were instantly overwhelmed. Within seconds, 3 Zeros were falling, trailing smoke and flames. "All aircraft, maintain formation," the strike leader's voice commanded over the radio. "Continue to target. Fighters will handle the..." The transmission ended in static. Abe saw the strike leader's aircraft stagger as a Hellcat's guns raked it from nose to tail. The Judy dove, trailing fire, its fuel tanks igniting in a brilliant orange fireball. The formation began to disintegrate as American fighters tore into it from multiple directions. These weren't the cautious, probing attacks Abe had encountered in 1942. The Americans flew with aggressive confidence, making high-speed passes that exploited their aircraft's superior speed and firepower. "Brake left! Brake left!" someone screamed over the radio. Abe pulled hard, his Judy groaning under the G-forces. Tracers arced past his canopy, close enough that he could see the individual rounds. A Hellcat flashed past, so close Abe could see the pilot's face. Young, determined, not the frightened novice Japanese propaganda had promised. The American reversed hard and came around for another pass. Yamada's machine gun chattered behind him, the tracers reaching for the Hellcat, but falling short. "I can't hit them! They're too fast!" The panic in his radio man's voice mirrored Abe's own growing terror. The Hellcat pilot lined up perfectly and opened fire. The sound of 50 caliber rounds punching through aluminum was distinct, a rapid metallic drumming that Abe felt through his seat. The instrument panel exploded in sparks. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. The Judy shuddered violently. "We're hit! We're hit!" Yamada shouted unnecessarily. Abe could feel the aircraft dying beneath his hands. The controls were sluggish, the right aileron unresponsive. Smoke began filling the cockpit, acrid and choking. He pushed the stick forward, diving for cloud cover, the altimeter unwinding rapidly. 12,000 feet, 10,000, 8,000. The Hellcat didn't follow. It was already engaging another victim. Abe leveled out at 5,000 feet, nursing the damaged aircraft westward. Around him, the sky was a nightmare of burning aircraft and parachutes. He counted at least 15 Japanese planes falling, their death dives marked by black smoke trails. The massive strike formation had been decimated in less than 5 minutes, and they hadn't even reached the American carriers yet. What kind of force could put 50 fighters in the air 60 miles from their fleet? "Abe-san, look ahead!" Yamada's voice had lost its panic, replaced by something worse: despair. Abe peered through the oil-smeared windscreen and understood immediately. On the horizon, scattered across perhaps 40 miles of ocean, he counted carriers. Not the 8 or 9 Japanese intelligence had reported, not 10 or 12. He counted 15 distinct carriers, each one surrounded by cruisers and destroyers, each one launching aircraft that rose into the sky like swarms of angry hornets. "Kuso," Abe whispered. It wasn't possible. The Americans had possessed 7 carriers at the start of the war. Japan had sunk 4. Where had 15 come from? These weren't the desperate survivors of Midway. These were brand new ships, their decks packed with aircraft, arrayed in perfect formations that spoke of unlimited resources and supreme confidence. A new group of Hellcats appeared, climbing from below. Abe counted 8 fighters, their wings still folded. They had just launched and were already at altitude. He pushed his crippled Judy into a shallow dive, heading for a convenient cloud layer. The Americans didn't pursue. They were too busy intercepting the remaining strike aircraft still attempting to reach the carriers. From 4,000 feet, Abe watched the slaughter. The survivors of his formation, perhaps 30 aircraft, pressed on toward the American fleet. They were met by a storm of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with shell bursts. The heavy cruiser's 5-inch guns created a barrage unlike anything Abe had seen in 2 years of carrier warfare. The shells burst in perfect patterns, their timing and spacing suggesting radar fire control. Another technology Japanese intelligence had assured them the Americans didn't possess in quantity. 3 dive bombers broke through the fighter screen and the anti-aircraft fire, diving toward a carrier. Abe recognized the ship class from intelligence briefs, an Essex class, one of the new American carriers. He watched, hoping desperately for success, as the first Judy rolled into its dive, its bomb visible as it fell away. The bomb missed by 50 yards, throwing up a massive waterspout. The second bomber exploded before releasing. A proximity-fused anti-aircraft shell had found it. The third bomber's bomb hit, but Abe's hope died as he saw the result, though explosion threw debris into the air. But the carrier continued steaming at full speed, its flight operations apparently uninterrupted. One bomb hit, and the carrier barely seemed to notice. More Hellcats were climbing now, and Abe turned west, coaxing his dying aircraft toward friendly waters. The engine temperature gauge was pegged in the red zone, and the oil pressure was dropping. He had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining before the engine seized. Yamada was silent behind him, and Abe didn't press for conversation. What could either of them say? They had just witnessed the death of Japanese naval aviation. The flight back to the fleet took 90 agonizing minutes. Abe nursed the failing engine, trading altitude for distance, gliding when possible to save fuel and reduce engine strain. The radio, what still functioned, told a story of disaster. Strike leaders calling for withdrawal, pilots reporting being out of ammunition and fuel, desperate calls from aircraft attempting to find carriers, any carriers, their navigation equipment damaged or their fuel exhausted. The professional chatter of experienced pilots had been replaced by frightened voices, many sounding impossibly young. As the Japanese fleet came into view, Abe felt his heart sink further. 3 of the 9 carriers he had seen that morning were gone. Taiho had fallen behind, listing heavily, black smoke pouring from her hull. Shokaku was burning, aircraft still visible on her deck. A destroyer was alongside, taking off survivors. Hio was nowhere to be seen. Already sunk, Abe would learn later. The decisive battle had turned into a massacre, and Japan had been on the wrong end of it. Zuikaku appeared ahead, her deck clear and ready for recovery. Abe began his approach, but his damaged Judy refused to cooperate. The hydraulics were gone, which meant no flaps, no landing gear. He made a hard decision and told Yamada to bail out. The radio man didn't argue, releasing the canopy and dropping into the sea below. Abe watched long enough to see the parachute deploy, then turned back to the carrier. Zuikaku, this is Abe. My aircraft is damaged, gear and flaps inoperative. I'm going in the water alongside. Negative, Abe-san. The air operations officer's voice was tight with stress. We're recovering damaged aircraft on deck. If you can make it alongside, we'll pick you up. Abe brought the Judy down in a controlled crash just 200 yards from Zuikaku's starboard side. The impact was brutal, the aircraft breaking apart on contact with the water. He released his harness and swam clear as the Judy sank rapidly, the ocean swallowing what remained of his aircraft. A destroyer picked him up 15 minutes later, cold, exhausted, and devastated. On the destroyer's deck, wrapped in a blanket, Abe watched the remaining aircraft attempting to land. Many were so damaged they crashed on the deck, creating obstacles that had to be pushed overboard before the next aircraft could land. Pilots who had burned through their fuel attempting to find the carriers were ditching in the sea, hoping for rescue before they drowned or succumbed to exposure. The organized precision of the morning launch had been replaced by desperate chaos. A young pilot, his flight suit scorched and his face blackened by smoke, was hauled aboard the destroyer while Abe watched. The pilot couldn't have been more than 20 years old, fresh from training. He sat on the deck, shaking, unable to speak coherently. When a medic finally got him to talk, his words confirmed what Abe already knew. "So many," the young pilot whispered. "The Americans have so many. We shot one down, 2 more appeared. We damaged 1 carrier, 3 more were right behind it. Their fighters are faster, their guns hit harder, they have radar that sees us coming. How do we fight this? How do we fight infinity?" The medic had no answer. Neither did Abe. As night fell on June 19, 1944, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Of the nearly 400 aircraft launched that morning, fewer than 100 had returned. 3 carriers had been sunk. The precious trained pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had fought since Pearl Harbor, were dead or exhausted, their confidence shattered. And tomorrow, the Americans would still have 15 carriers, their decks full of aircraft, ready to continue the slaughter. Abe stood at the destroyer's rail, staring east toward where the American fleet steamed in the darkness. Somewhere out there, on carriers with names like Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, and Hornet, American pilots were celebrating their victory. They had destroyed the largest carrier strike Japan had ever launched, doing it with such casual efficiency that it suggested they'd been fighting this way for years, and perhaps, in a sense, they had. They'd been preparing for this moment since 1940, building carriers in their shipyards while Japan dreamed of decisive battles and warrior spirit. The young pilot's question haunted Abe through the long night. How do you fight infinity? The answer, Abe knew with cold certainty, was that you didn't. You couldn't. Japan had gambled everything on a decisive battle, and they had encountered not a fleet, but an industrial phenomenon. An America that could afford to lose 4 carriers in 1942 and respond by building 24. That could absorb the loss of Midway and replace it within months. That treated fleet carriers the way Japan treated destroyers, as production items to be built by the dozen. Standing on that destroyer's deck, watching Zuikaku's silhouette against the stars, Abe understood what Admiral Yamamoto had tried to warn them about before Pearl Harbor. America wasn't just another nation. It was a different order of industrial power, and Japan had woken it up, prodded it into action, and now would face the consequences. The decisive battle had occurred, but not the way Japanese doctrine had envisioned. It had been decided not by tactics or courage, but by the ability to put 15 carriers in the ocean while Japan struggled to maintain 9. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more deaths, more desperate struggles, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan had faced American industrial power in the Philippine Sea and learned a terrible truth. They weren't fighting a navy. They were fighting shipyards in Newport News and Brooklyn and Philadelphia, and those shipyards would keep producing carriers long after Japan's last pilot fell from the sky. The weeks following the Philippine Sea revealed the full extent of Japan's predicament to officers across the Imperial Navy. Commander Tamichi Hara, a destroyer captain with the combined fleet, recorded his observations in letters that would survive the war. "We had always known the Americans possessed industrial capacity," he wrote in July 1944. "What we failed to understand was that they would use it. They build carriers the way we build rifles, in vast quantities, without regard for individual perfection. knowing that volume will overcome any qualitative advantage we might possess. Japanese naval intelligence scrambled to understand the scope of American carrier production. Reports filtered in from neutral sources, from intercepted communications, from prisoners of war who spoke freely about their service. Each report painted the same impossible picture. America was commissioning a new Essex-class carrier every 60 days. By August 1944, 16 were operational. By October, 18. And the production showed no signs of slowing. The strategic implications rippled through Japanese planning. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly appointed commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, received briefing materials in October that laid out the mathematics of impossibility. His staff had compiled American carrier deployments across the Pacific, and the numbers defied comprehension. Task Force 38 operated with 16 carriers in the Western Pacific. Additional Essex-class carriers operated with the British Pacific Fleet. More were in training operations off the American coast. Still more were fitting out in shipyards or completing sea trials. "How many do they have?" Onishi asked his intelligence officer during a briefing at Wildcat Airfield in the Philippines. 18 confirmed Essex-class commissioned, with 6 more under construction, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, plus dozens of escort carriers for convoy protection and ground support. "Admiral, they have more carriers in reserve than we have in our entire Navy." Onishi stared at the map showing American carrier positions. Red symbols marked known task force locations, and they covered the Pacific like a rash. "And ours?" 6 fleet carriers operational, 4 light carriers, all with depleted air groups and insufficient replacement pilots. The intelligence officer hesitated before adding, "Admiral, at current loss rates versus American replacement rates, we calculate that by January 1945, the Americans will have 25 Essex-class carriers operational. We will have perhaps 3 fleet carriers still capable of operations." The calculus led Onishi to a desperate conclusion. If conventional attacks couldn't overcome American numerical superiority, then unconventional methods were required. The Special Attack Corps, kamikaze units, were born not from fanaticism, but from mathematical desperation. When one side possessed 25 carriers and the other possessed 3, traditional naval warfare became impossible. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, selected to lead the first organized kamikaze attack, understood this with brutal clarity. An experienced pilot with over 500 flight hours, Seki had initially opposed the suicide missions. But when shown the intelligence estimates of American carrier strength, his opposition softened. "If we must die," he told fellow pilots at Wildcat in October 1944, "better to die achieving something than to be shot down helplessly by their endless fighters." The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Admiral Ozawa, recovered from his Philippine Sea disaster, and now commanding what remained of Japan's carrier force, received orders that confirmed Japan's desperation. He would take 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, equipped with just 108 aircraft total, and act as bait to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches at Leyte. 108 aircraft, Ozawa told his staff officers aboard Zuikaku on October 24th. A single American Essex-class carrier operates 90 aircraft. We're offering them 4 carriers with the air group of 1 American ship, hoping they'll consider us worth chasing. The assignment was a death sentence, and everyone in the room knew it. Japan's carrier force had been reduced to expendable decoys because they no longer possessed the aircraft or pilots to make them combat effective. The operation proceeded as Ozawa expected and feared. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, with 6 Essex-class carriers and their escorts, took the bait and pursued Ozawa's force north. American scout planes located the Japanese carriers on the morning of October 25th, and the response demonstrated the crushing superiority on what the American production had created. Halsey launched over 500 aircraft from his 6 carriers, 5 times the total Japanese air strength, in a series of strikes that methodically destroyed Ozawa's force. Lieutenant David McCampbell, commanding Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, led the first strike against Ozawa's carriers. Years later, he would recall the almost clinical precision of the attack. We approached expecting resistance, expecting to fight for every attack run. Instead, we found 4 carriers with virtually no air cover, their decks nearly empty. It wasn't a battle. It was target practice. We knew immediately this was a diversion, but we had so many carriers that Admiral Halsey could spare 6 to eliminate the Japanese force and still have more carriers protecting the invasion fleet than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor attack force, absorbed over 20 bomb and torpedo hits before capsizing. Ozawa transferred his flag to a cruiser and watched as his 4 carriers sank one by one throughout the afternoon. The diversion worked tactically. Halsey was drawn away from the landing beaches, but the strategic message was unmistakable. Japan could no longer use its carriers for anything except suicide missions. The Essex-class production had created American carrier superiority so overwhelming that Japan couldn't even defend its own carriers effectively. American pilots returning from the strikes found the victory hollow. Ensign Thomas Lupo, flying an SB-2C Helldiver from USS Hornet, recorded his thoughts that evening. "We sank 4 Japanese carriers today, and it felt wrong somehow. 2 years ago, this would have been a decisive victory. Now it's just cleanup. We have so many carriers that losing the entire task force wouldn't significantly impact American naval strength. They have so few that losing 4 means they essentially have no carrier force left. It's not war anymore. It's extermination." The pace of American carrier deployments accelerated even as Japan's carrier force disappeared. USS Shangri-La, commissioned in September 1944, named for the fictional location Roosevelt had claimed was the Doolittle Raid's launch point. USS Lake Champlain, commissioned in November. USS Bonhomme Richard in December. Each new carrier joined a fleet that had long since achieved absolute superiority. The question was no longer whether America would win, but how quickly they could project sufficient force to end the war. By January 1945, Task Force 38 operated with 17 carriers, including 11 Essex-class. They launched strikes against Formosa, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands with impunity. Japanese opposition had become so feeble that the primary danger to American aircraft came from weather and mechanical failure rather than enemy action. The carriers that Japan had once feared, that had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific, were gone, sunk, damaged beyond repair, or trapped in port without fuel or aircraft. The contrast in operational capability was starkest during the Okinawa campaign in April 1945. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's invasion force was supported by 40 carriers, including 14 Essex-class, that maintained continuous air cover over the island for months. Japan responded with kamikaze attacks that, despite their fanaticism, couldn't overcome the mathematical advantage America possessed. For every American carrier damaged by kamikaze, 2 more were available to replace it. For every pilot lost, 10 trained replacements waited on escort, carriers serving as training platforms. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, Senior Air Operations Officer for the Japanese 5th Air Fleet, watched the Okinawa campaign unfold with detached despair. His diary, recovered after the war, captured the hopelessness. April 12, 1945. Another mass attack launched today. We sent 185 aircraft, mostly trainers and obsolete bombers flown by pilots with less than 100 hours of flight time. American radar detected them 60 miles out. Their fighters intercepted in overwhelming numbers. Of 185 aircraft, perhaps 30 reached the fleet. They claimed several hits, but tomorrow the Americans will have the same number of carriers as today. We cannot replace our losses. This mathematics cannot be overcome by courage or determination. The Essex-class carriers proved nearly indestructible. USS Franklin absorbed 2 bomb hits from a Japanese dive bomber on March 19, 1945, triggering fires and explosions that killed 724 men. The ship should have sunk. The damage exceeded what had destroyed any Japanese carrier. Instead, damage control parties fought the fires for 5 hours while the ship maintained steerage. Franklin limped back to Pearl Harbor under her own power, was repaired, and returned to service. USS Bunker Hill suffered 2 kamikaze hits on May 11th, killing 346 men and destroying most of the flight deck. The ship remained afloat, was towed to Puget Sound, and was being repaired when the war ended. We designed them to survive. Commander Leslie Kniskern, the original Essex-class design officer, explained to Navy investigators examining Franklin's damage. Every system has redundancy. Every compartment can be isolated. The flight deck isn't structural, so it can be blown off without sinking the ship. We assumed these carriers would take damage. We built them to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The Japanese built their carriers to be perfect. We built ours to be indestructible. And then we built 24 of them. Japanese naval officers captured during the final months of the war spoke with resignation rather than bitterness about American carrier superiority. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer who had helped plot the Pearl Harbor attack, was interviewed by American intelligence in September 1945. His assessment was clinical. We attacked Pearl Harbor believing we had destroyed your carrier strength by sinking your battleships. This was our fundamental mistake. We didn't understand that you would abandon the battleship paradigm entirely and build a carrier fleet that made our own obsolete through sheer numbers. Every assumption in our war planning was wrong because we couldn't imagine an enemy who would build carriers as rapidly as you built destroyers. The numbers told the story with unambiguous clarity. Japan began the war with 10 carriers and built 7 more during the conflict, for a total of 17. Losses exceeded production, and by war's end, Japan possessed no operational fleet. Carriers. America began the war with 7 carriers in the Pacific, lost 4, and commissioned 24 Essex-class alone, not counting 9 Independence-class light carriers, dozens of escort carriers, and 3 Midway-class carriers completed just after the war. American carrier construction exceeded Japanese production by a ratio of 5-to-1. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was the philosophy behind them. Japan treated carriers as precious assets to be preserved and risked only in decisive battles. America treated them as tools to be used aggressively, knowing that losses could be replaced within months. Japanese carriers required years to build and were irreplaceable once lost. American carriers were designed for mass production and deployed in such numbers that losing several didn't significantly impact operational capability. The final testimony came from Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, interrogated by American intelligence in November 1945. Asked about the turning point of the naval war, Toyoda didn't cite a specific battle. The war was lost when we realized you could build carriers faster than we could sink them. After the Philippine Sea, we knew. After Leyte Gulf, everyone knew. By 1945, you had so many carriers that you could afford to use some for training while still maintaining overwhelming strength at the front. We couldn't even maintain a single carrier division. The mathematics were impossible, and mathematics don't care about courage or determination. The Essex-class carriers continued operations through the final weeks of the war, launching strikes against the Japanese home islands right up until August 15, 1945. Their aircraft swept the skies clear of opposition. Their bombs and rockets destroyed what little remained of Japan's military infrastructure, and their presence offshore provided undeniable proof that resistance was futile. When the surrender documents were signed aboard USS Missouri on September 2nd, Essex-class carriers filled Tokyo Bay, silent monuments to the industrial capacity that had decided the war long before the final battles were fought. The statistics behind the Essex-class program defied every assumption about shipbuilding that had governed naval construction since the age of sail. Traditional wisdom held that building a fleet carrier required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. The Essex program demolished that timeline through industrial methods that transformed warship construction into something resembling automobile assembly. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia became the exemplar of this revolution. The yard's workers, at peak production in 1943, were completing an Essex-class carrier every 6 months, while simultaneously working on 3 others in various stages of construction. Each carrier required 2.5 million man-hours of labor, consumed 55,000 tons of steel, utilized 8 miles of electrical wiring, and integrated 47,000 pumps. Individual components manufactured by 1,200 subcontractors across 32 states. The complexity matched any ship ever built, yet the production timeline was cut in half through sheer organizational efficiency. Mary Ellen Brown, a welder at Newport News from 1942 to 1945, described the atmosphere in a 1987 oral history interview. "We worked 3 shifts, around the clock, 7 days a week. The yard was lit up like a city at night. You could see it from miles away. We knew the boys were dying in the Pacific, and every day we didn't finish a carrier meant more boys would die. So we worked. I welded seams on USS Ticonderoga, USS Randolph, USS Shangri-La. When the war ended, I'd helped build 7 carriers. 7. I'm just one welder, and I helped build more carriers than Japan built during the entire war." The Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York achieved similar results through innovative prefabrication techniques. Rather than building carriers sequentially, workers assembled major sections, bow, stern, engine rooms, hangar bays, in separate facilities, and then integrated them in the dry dock. This parallel construction reduced the critical path and allowed less experienced workers to participate in sophisticated tasks. By 1944, 70% of Brooklyn Navy Yard workers were women, many of whom had never seen a ship before Pearl Harbor. Their output exceeded peacetime yards staffed entirely by experienced male workers. The human cost of this production miracle was measured in injuries rather than lives. Shipyard work was dangerous. Falls, burns, crushing injuries, and deaths occurred regularly. OSHA didn't exist in 1943, and safety standards were minimal. Yet workers accepted these risks as part of their contribution to victory. The casualty rate among American shipyard workers exceeded that of many rear-echelon military units. But they kept building, kept welding, kept riveting. The economic impact was staggering. Each Essex-class carrier cost approximately $68 million in 1943 dollars, equivalent to roughly $1.2 billion today. The 24 ships represented $1.632 billion in wartime spending, a sum that would have bankrupted most nations. America absorbed this cost while simultaneously funding the Manhattan Project, building hundreds of escort carriers, producing thousands of aircraft, and maintaining two massive ground armies on opposite sides of the world. The scale of expenditure revealed an industrial base operating at capacity levels no other nation could approach. Japanese economists analyzing these figures after the war struggled to comprehend the disparity. Japan's entire 1943 military budget was approximately $8 billion in contemporary dollars. America spent $1.6 billion on a single class of warship while maintaining military expenditures that exceeded Japan's entire GDP. The economic contest hadn't been close. It had been a mismatch so fundamental that Japan never had a realistic chance of victory once American industry mobilized. The technology embedded in each Essex-class carrier represented another dimension of American advantage. The ships featured radar systems so advanced that Japanese intelligence initially dismissed reports of their capabilities as propaganda. The SK air search radar could detect aircraft at 100 miles, providing warning times that Japanese carriers couldn't match. The SM fire control radar made the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns devastatingly effective, achieving hit probabilities that exceeded Japanese weapons by an order of magnitude. The Combat Information Center, a darkened room deep in the ship where radar plots and communications were centralized, revolutionized carrier operations. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Bryan, who served as CIC officer aboard USS Hornet, explained the advantage in a 1946 after-action report. We could track every aircraft within 100 miles, coordinate fighter interceptions before enemy bombers reached visual range, and maintain complete situational awareness throughout the battle. Japanese carriers fought blind by comparison. They relied on visual observation and radio reports. We had a god's-eye view of the entire battlefield. The pilots who flew from Essex-class decks benefited from another American advantage: unlimited training. The U.S. Navy established massive training programs that produced 60,000 naval aviators during the war. Each pilot received a minimum 300 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. By comparison, Japanese pilots in 1944 often entered combat with fewer than 100 total flight hours. The quality differential wasn't about individual talent, it was about resources devoted to training. America could afford to spend 2 years training a pilot. Japan needed pilots immediately and sent them into combat after cursory instruction. The survival rates reflected this disparity. American carrier pilots in 1944 to 1945 had a 75% chance of surviving their combat tour. Japanese pilots in the same period had less than a 10% survival rate. This wasn't because Japanese pilots lacked courage. It was because they faced overwhelming numerical and technological superiority that courage couldn't overcome. An Essex-class carrier could generate 120 sorties per day indefinitely. A Japanese carrier, even if undamaged, struggled to generate 60 sorties per day and lacked the spare parts, fuel, and ammunition to sustain operations for more than a few days. The Essex-class carriers' post-war service proved their design's fundamental soundness. While Japan's carriers had been fragile specialists, optimized for the Pacific War's early battles, the Essex ships were adaptable generalists. 15 of the 24 ships underwent extensive modernization in the 1950s, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and upgraded electronics that allowed them to operate jet aircraft. USS Lexington, the last of the class, remained in service until 1991, 48 years after commissioning. No warship class in history served as long or adapted to as many technological revolutions. Korean War operations demonstrated the class's enduring value. USS Essex, Valley Forge, Philippine Sea, Boxer, Leyte, Princeton, and Bonhomme Richard all saw combat off Korea, their aircraft providing close air support and interdiction missions. The ships designed to destroy Japanese carriers adapted seamlessly to ground support roles, their flexible design accommodating everything from prop-driven Corsairs to early jets like the F9F Panther. Vietnam saw Essex-class carriers conducting combat operations 2 decades after World War II ended. USS Oriskany, Ticonderoga, Hancock, Intrepid, and Bonhomme Richard all flew missions over North Vietnam, their aging airframes still capable of generating the sortie rates required for sustained operations. The adaptability that Commander Kaniskern had designed into the ships in 1940 paid dividends across 3 wars and 5 decades of service. 4 Essex-class carriers survive today as museum ships: USS Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina, USS Intrepid in New York City, USS Hornet in Alameda, California, and USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. Visitors walking their decks can see the combination of rugged construction and thoughtful design that made them devastatingly effective. The compartmentation that saved USS Franklin. The deck edge elevators that allowed continued operations even with severe damage. The spacious hangar decks that accommodated decades of increasingly larger aircraft. Japanese officers who survived the war often visited these museum ships, paying respects to the vessels that had destroyed their navy. In 1985, at a reunion aboard USS Yorktown, former Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, now 89 years old and frail but still mentally sharp, stood on the flight deck with former American carrier captains. A reporter asked him when he knew Japan had lost the war. Ozawa didn't hesitate. June 19, 1944, the first day of the Philippine Sea Battle. I commanded 9 carriers that morning, the largest force Japan ever assembled. I watched my aircraft launch, believing we would achieve the decisive victory our doctrine promised. Then the reports began arriving. Not 8 American carriers, as intelligence had reported. Not 10. 15 carriers in a single task force, with more elsewhere. In that moment, I understood what Admiral Yamamoto had tried to warn us about before Pearl Harbor. He walked slowly across Yorktown's deck, his hand trailing along the non-skid surface. This ship, she is USS Yorktown, but not the Yorktown we sank at Midway. That Yorktown sank in June 1942. This Yorktown was commissioned 10 months later. 10 months. We could not build a carrier in 3 years, and you built one in 10 months, named it after the ship we sank, and sent it to sink our carriers. This told us everything about why we lost. An American reporter pressed him. But Admiral, Japanese carriers like Taiho were superior individually to the Essex class. Better armor, more advanced. Ozawa cut him off with a sharp gesture. Superior individually? Perhaps. But you had 24. We built 7 carriers during the war. 7. You built 24 of this single class, plus dozens of other carriers. Quality means nothing when the enemy has 30 times your quantity. We designed beautiful carriers that required 3 years to build. You designed adequate carriers that required 18 months to build and then built them by the dozen. We played chess. You played industrial warfare. There was never any contest. The American admiral standing beside Ozawa, former Captain Frederick Sherman, who had commanded USS Lexington CV-16, added context. Admiral Ozawa is being modest. His carriers at Philippine Sea were outnumbered, but the battle wasn't close. Our pilots shot down over 400 of his aircraft while losing perhaps 20 of our own. Our radar gave us perfect situational awareness. Our fighters were faster, better armed, and our pilots had 3 times the training hours. The Essex carriers were just the platform. They enabled everything else. We could afford to train pilots for 2 years because we had enough carriers to maintain frontline strength while rotating squadrons through training. Japan couldn't afford that luxury. The numbers that so impressed Ozawa represented only part of the story. America built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, and 77 escort carriers during the war. This total of 110 carriers exceeded the combined carrier production of every other nation in history. Japan built 17 carriers total across its entire naval history. Britain built 13 during the war. America built more carriers in 1943 alone than Japan built in its entire existence as a naval power. The production rate peaked in 1944, when America commissioned 12 fleet and light carriers, 1 every 30 days. Japanese shipyards, simultaneously, struggled to complete a single carrier. The disparity wasn't about superior American shipbuilding technique. It was about industrial capacity operating at scales Japan couldn't conceptualize. American GDP in 1944 exceeded $2 trillion in modern dollars. Japanese GDP was approximately $200 billion. The economic mismatch was 10 to 1, and it showed in every dimension of military production. Standing on Taiho's bridge that June morning in 1944, watching his aircraft launch toward what he believed would be a decisive victory, Vice Admiral Ozawa had been confident in Japanese tactical superiority. By evening, standing on a cruiser's bridge watching his carriers burn, he understood that tactics were irrelevant when the enemy could absorb any defeat and return stronger. The Americans didn't need to win battles. They just needed to keep building carriers until Japan ran out of ships, pilots, and hope. The Essex-class program proved that modern warfare between industrial powers would be decided by production capacity, not by warrior spirit or tactical brilliance. Japan fought with courage and skill, but courage couldn't overcome 15 carriers when you possessed 9. Skill couldn't compensate when American pilots had 3 times the training hours, and warrior spirit meant nothing when the enemy's shipyards built carriers faster than you could sink them. The final assessment came from Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Japan's last wartime naval commander, in his 1947 memoir. We lost the war in December 1941 when we attacked Pearl Harbor. We simply didn't realize it until June 1944, when we saw what American industry had accomplished. They didn't defeat us with superior tactics. They defeated us by building 24 Essex-class carriers while we struggled to replace even 1. The decisive battle was fought not at sea, but in their shipyards, and we were never even present on that battlefield. The admiral who had watched 9 carriers launch their aircraft into the dawn on June 19, 1944, believing decisive victory was at hand, had witnessed instead the death of Japanese naval aviation, destroyed not by American combat prowess, but by American industrial capacity. The Essex-class carriers were the physical manifestation of a truth Japan had refused to accept. In industrial warfare, the nation with the bigger factories wins, and America's factories were unmatched in human history. The story of the Essex-class carriers isn't just about ships and statistics. It's about what happens when industrial democracy mobilizes against militaristic empire, when production capacity becomes the ultimate weapon, and when a nation decides that victory is worth whatever it costs to achieve. If you found this deep dive into World War II's most significant warship class compelling, there's much more to explore. This channel specializes in uncovering the counterintuitive truths of World War II, the moments when assumptions shattered, when the enemy discovered they'd fundamentally misunderstood their opponent, and when industrial capacity rewrote the rules of warfare. From the German tank commander, who captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel and realized Germany was doomed, to the Japanese ace who said, "We shot down Americans every week, but they came back by the dozens." These are the stories where the mathematics of war collided with human experience. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to join us for the next investigation into the weapons, logistics, and industrial miracles that decided history's largest conflict. Because understanding how 24 carriers defeated an empire teaches us something profound about the nature of modern warfare and about ourselves. The comments section below is open for your thoughts, questions, and stories. Many of you serve or have family who served on these ships. Your experiences add depth to the historical record, and this community values that contribution. What aspect of the Essex-class story surprised you most? What should we investigate next? New videos drop weekly, each one diving deep into a single weapon, battle, or industrial achievement that changed everything. This isn't surface-level history. It's the kind of research and storytelling that takes weeks to produce and reveals truths that textbooks miss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.